I'll assume we're ready to go since we've got kind of a full study session today, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Driscoll.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to be a short bit here at the beginning and a very short bit at the end, and leave the rest to Marty to get into the details, because I think that's what we're here for. Just as a quick reminder, if you're catching up, this is presentation 2 in a 4-presentation series. We started this conversation off by just kind of all agreeing that we're on the same page, that housing is an issue and what that looked like and how we wanted to move forward. And that evolved into updating the Live Salina plan. This presentation is focusing primarily on a demographics update and also addressing an example pro forma for multifamily. Where that really kind of originated from was a lot of the questions that we were asking as a community. Why is it so expensive to build multifamily? Why aren't we building more multifamily? With the new employees come to town, how many new houses do we need? What does this picture really look like, so that we could understand from a policy perspective and an action perspective what our future would look like. The meeting that will come after this is the first Monday in April, and that's the 3rd presentation, and that's going to focus a little bit more on other types of incentive tools that could be applicable here in Salina that we may want to use, and also doing a comparison with other communities and how they're reacting to some of these same issues that we are having. We are not alone in this housing crisis. It is across the country. And then lastly, the 4th meeting, which will be the first Monday in May, will take really the feedback the commission's been giving and start to outline a roadmap of sorts for implementing any new incentive policies or housing policies the commission thinks necessary to get to the objective of how do we address some of these problems, which ideally brings us right back to where we're at today, is understanding that problem. With that, I'm going to introduce Marty Schukert. Marty is with RDG Planning and Design. He worked with the community before. He helped to draft the Live Salina plan, which was adopted in 2016, and that is our current housing plan. And asked Marty to come back and help us update this information, help us, since he's so familiar with the community, also help us understand what's going on in the region. RDG is works throughout the Midwest, working with many of our neighbors in other states, and brings a lot of great insight. Marty's been doing this kind of work for over 40 years and is actually a pillar in the planning community. So we're very blessed to have him. Even longer than that. So yeah. Marty's a great resource, and we're just appreciative of having him here and the resources that RDG brings to this project. With that, Marty, if you want to kick us off.
Thanks, Lauren. Great. Well, it's great to be with you this afternoon and taking you through a little bit of a tour through housing land here on this beautiful afternoon in March. As Lauren said, what I'm going to do is to go through a process of talking about needs and demand based on the latest information that we've got, which is the 2019 American Community Survey. The ACS is done every year by the Bureau of the Census, and it's done on the basis of a random survey. So the data are not as accurate as the actual census count might be, but they're the best thing that we have right now to be able to go on. So we're going to start out with population assumptions. These are when we're projecting future growth, the numbers and assumptions that we work from to help generate as accurate a forecast as we can. And by the way, if you have a question or need clarification, please let me know. I can get going like a locomotive and never stop. So if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt. So first of all, looking forward 10 years, we project.
Real quick, Jacob,
Okay.
Would you please share the presentation? Perfect.
Right.
And just so the mayor knows and everybody watching at home, Deputy City Manager Woods is running the PowerPoint. So Marty, if you could just, when you need a next slide, just hit next slide and Jacob will move it along.
Right. Next slide. And next one after that too. And even after that, there we go. And one more. There we go. Okay, so here you see the assumptions that we're using in projecting population for Salina going forward. First of all, we are suggesting a 0.36% annual growth rate for the next 10 years. Live Salina was a little more optimistic than that. It predicted a 0.5% per year, but the performance over the last 10 has not generated that. 0.36% is the average growth rate that we have experienced in Salina over the last 30 years. So using that as a base number is a pretty good assumption. It's relatively conservative, but since people rely on these studies for making investments, it's not a bad thing to be conservative. Certainly one thing that generates a demand for housing and positive growth in its base is the fact that we now have over 1,100 existing open jobs in the Salina market, according to the Chamber of Commerce. It is important to note that whatever we project in 2021 can change dramatically. So if a new plant or a new facility opens that we didn't anticipate, it could throw those numbers off. But for right now, this is a pretty good guess.
Mr. Schugert, you said to jump in, so I wanted to ask a question just in terms of your assumptions. When I look at the census data that's available from 2010 to 2019, it shows us like a 2.5–3% actual population decline. And I understand you're taking a longer look at that over a 30-year period, but given some of the demographic trends in terms of rural communities having a lot more outmigration to urban communities, I mean, do you think that 0.36% annual growth rate is maybe still a little bit optimistic?
No, actually not.
Okay.
And it's a great question. First of all, ACS I think tends to underestimate population, number one. So these numbers, it's weird that they tend, to my mind, and they tend to underestimate population and overestimate vacancy. So whether those things are related or not, I don't know. But I think that we have generally found that to be the case. Number two is population increases are conditional upon, for example, building housing. So if you're not producing or underproducing housing and generating a demand for it, those people are not homeless. They're going somewhere else, but it just doesn't happen to be Salina. So that's going to tend to drive population down as well. So look at a positive growth rate as being conditional. If we do things that accommodate this population potential, we will achieve that population potential, if that makes sense at all. But
yeah, yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, but it's a great question. Okay, so number two is that we know that there's going to be significant industrial expansion. So the chamber is documenting between now and 2025, 900 new jobs in Salina, in the adjacent industrial areas. And from 25 to 2030, 200 new jobs in addition to that are already more or less in the bank. Now, again, keep in mind that these are projections and plans, and it would be wonderful if it were more. It would not be so good if it were less, but they seem to be pretty imminent in terms of specific industries telling the chamber they're going to be hiring new jobs. So this is Vision Aviation, Great Plains, Schwann's, and there'll be a host of other smaller ones too. Now, we don't assume that 900 jobs translates to 900 households. That just doesn't happen, because there'll be people who will work in Salina and live in Lindsborg or even places that are farther away or in rural areas. And a lot of times projections will make the mistake of saying, oh, 900 jobs means we need to build 900 housing units. That doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. So as a correction factor, we assume that 40% of those potential jobs, assuming they're full-time jobs, are going to generate new potential households in Salina. And so we add that back into the base population projection. And then we're assuming from a population perspective, although this is kind of irrelevant when you're looking at households, that the number of people per household will be the same as we have right now, which is about 2.38. And that's interesting too, because households on one end are getting bigger as households like my kids have children, and they're getting smaller on the other side, where households like mine get smaller, unfortunately. So it's a pretty good projection over the next 10 years to keep that number constant. Then finally we come to household population. So it's important to understand that households are what generate housing units. Households mean the number of people who live in the city who don't live in group quarters. Group quarters being nursing homes or college dormitories or other kinds of congregate living situations. That number in Salina is 97%. So 97% of Salina's population lives in a household of some sort, maybe a one-person household, but generating a demand for an independent housing unit. So those are the numbers that we are using in terms of looking forward to 2030, and that becomes the basic generator of new housing demand. So if we could have the next slide. So this is what that number looks like from now until 2030, and I think somebody's speaker is open. Or good, there it goes. Okay, so I'm in a ballpark here, and you can get an echo when the public the PA announcer announces the pinch hitters. Those of you who are aficionados of the movie Airplane will know what I'm talking about there. But so we are assuming that the 2020 count, when it comes in, will be a little bit more than the 2019 ACS, and that count that we're using is 47,162. If you remember the ACS, the number that's in that document is 43,000, I think 900, like that. It's 46,988. So a little bit of population growth. Using the assumptions that we are using, with those new jobs, we'll get a pretty big spike in the next 5 years, up to 48,974, and then a slower, kind of more normal increase in the next 5 years after that, possibly breaking the 50,000 mark. And again, assume that these are potential populations and not necessarily predicted populations. So to achieve that number means building housing so that people actually live in Salina. You'll see in the next row the number of those people who are attributable to employment expansions. These are the new households, 40% of the projected population of projected job growth that will establish households in Salina. And the demand that those households will create will add up to, by 2025, 19,960 households or units of housing, and 20,400 by 2030. So those are the base numbers that we are using right now to project overall housing need. Next slide. And again, if you have a question, please feel free to stop me. Okay, there are a few other assumptions that we use in looking at housing need forecasts going forward. The ACS uses or assumes in 2019 that there's a 6.2% vacancy rate in Salina. We know that that's overstated. It may not be overstated if we consider all housing units rather than habitable housing units. So a lot of this number is generated by units that are uninhabitable. They may even be older mobile homes or things like that, as you know, as we know from our previous studies in Salina, that does exist. So we are assuming that rate, real or not, will remain stable. So we're taking that factor out of the equation. 6% is a pretty reasonable vacancy rate anyway to provide choice in the housing market. And as you'll see in a couple of minutes, when we've done surveys of existing rental housing, it's very hard to find a rental unit in a contemporary development in the city of Salina. We also, another factor, small factor that contributes to housing demand is replacement. So here we're looking at the number of demolitions, of residential demolitions that have taken place over the last 10 years, and projecting that forward into the next 5 years. So between 2010 and 2020, in Salina, there's been demolition of an average of 16 units per year, and we're just continuing that number on for the next 10 years.
If I might interrupt, this is Commissioner Frand. I was a little surprised by that number. What is happening to these places where the homes are being demolished? Are they staying as vacant lots? Are they, being redeveloped? Are they being sold to neighbors as an ancillary to the existing property? I mean, what's happening to them?
That's probably a good question for Lauren, but usually it's all of the above. So there'll be some vacant lots. There'll be some cases where these are units that are lost in order to build something else. So for example, typically a commercial expansion will buy a house or two next door, demolish those and expand. So it's not necessarily all a bad thing. It just so we don't know what, and in some cases, yes, those lots will be purchased by a neighbor and they'll demolish the house and do a garden or something of that sort. So the disposition can be everything that you mentioned, but they're just, from our perspective right now, they're lost housing units that have gone out of the inventory. And within the next couple of months, we'll be looking at where those vacant lots might be clustered and how they might be reused. So finally, the assumption on occupancy, and that's how much do we need from an owner versus rental point of view. We are assuming, and again, these are assumptions, that our need over the next 5 years will be about 50-50. That is, the people will take jobs and be looking for rental units in the short term. So the demand for rental units will be somewhat or a little bit higher than the existing percentage of owner to rental occupancy. That will change over the following 5 years to be a more normal 60-40 rental owner rental split as people settle down and we're in kind of a more normal housing production market. So again, these assumptions are changeable. I mean, we can vary these and they'll produce a little bit different numbers, but for right now, they're probably a pretty good working assumption. So now let's go to the next slide. So here's what this all means when we do the numbers and put all of this together. So you'll see in the third row, in the first row, the demand created by actual households for occupied units. We then add in a vacancy factor, which increases that number so that there's choice in the market. You don't want to have only the number of units as you have people, because then there's nowhere to move. It is a market that just doesn't, that people can't find a place to live. We then add in the replacement need, and those numbers together give us the overall housing need that number of housing units that we need at the end of each of those 5-year periods. And so we then calculate the need for that period by taking the difference between the end of the period and the beginning of the previous period. So for 2020 to 2025, that's going to be 21,279 minus 20,462. That and for 2030 to 2025, that demand over that 5-year elapsed period will be 21,748 minus 21,279. So the cumulative need, the number of target units to build for base population growth and new jobs over this next 5 years is 865 units based on our assumptions, which we think are reasonable ones. And then from 2025 to 2030, based on what we know now, that will drop off to 469. That means an average annual production of about 170 units or so over the next for the next 5 years, that then will drop off to about 94. Now, keep in mind that in Live Salina, which we did in 2016, using a 5% or a 0.5% growth rate, we were looking at about 105 to 110 units a year. So, so our projections are a little bit more modest than that in the 2025 to 2030 range, but considerably higher than that because of job growth in the 2020 to 25 range. Now we split those up. So if we're assuming 50-50 split, that will translates to 432 owner-occupied units and 433 rental units, because we can't build half a unit. So and it's an odd number. So it's we gave the majority here to the rental units.
Marty, I'm sorry, Commissioner, just interrupt. Either my math is off, if I is off. I'm coming up with 817. Between 20 and 2025.
Yeah, and
the overall picture may not make a big difference when you spread it out.
Yeah, but it's a good catch, and I think the problem is that my base number is off.
Okay.
The 865 is right, and the 2462 is wrong.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Yeah, but that's a good catch. We'll check it, but yeah, but I think that's what's going on, because the 490 figure should match that too. Yeah, yeah, I'll check. There's something wrong in the spreadsheet.
All right, thank you.
Okay, yeah, great, but thanks. We'll definitely check that out. Yeah, it's going to be in the same. It's not going to make a lot of difference, but it's a great catch. In fact, as soon as we're done, I'm going to fix it. Otherwise, I'll forget. Okay, so then that number, as you can see, changes to a different equation or different distribution in the following 5 years of 60% or 281 owner-occupied units and 188 rental-occupied units in that following 5-year period. Next slide, please. Now, what have we been doing in the past? Well, this is the construction activity in Salina for the next 10 years. So you can see that up through 2012, we're developing housing at a fairly reasonable rate. And then that dropped off significantly, particularly in the single family detached range. We really haven't built very much in terms of rental housing. So that 32 units that you see in 2011 is the Heritage at Hawthorne. And the 53 units that you see in 2020 is Lee Lofts. but there's not very much there other than those two significant projects. And that's really our immediate problem, is the lack, is a real lack of rental production. The other interesting thing, and this is a phenomenon that we're seeing in a lot of communities, is why is there such a drop off in single family detached development when the economy has been quite good between 2010 or kind of earlier parts of the decade and the later parts of the decade. And the reason for that, I'm convinced, or the explanation for it, is that we are building single family with increasing construction costs. We're building single family houses for a diminishing sector of the market. So when you can't build something for less than $300,000, the number of people who are being served by the single family construction market, despite lower interest rates, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so so the piece of pie that's accounted for by single family detached is getting smaller and smaller. That's not a subject that we'll get into in great detail today, but it will be a subject for our next time together as we look with a little bit more focus at single family development too. So over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 20, we have generated an average of 63 units a year. Keep in mind that the kind of stable 0.36% growth is about 90 units per year, a little bit fewer than that. But our demand is still lower. Our demand is still higher than growth. And you can see that we have demolished or lost 175 units. So our net gain is 511, or about 47 units per year over the last 10 years. And that, I think in Salina's case, accounts for some of the fact that the population does not seem to have grown to the rate that it could have. So next slide. This is interesting, and it's the hardest comparison or hardest table that we have to explain. But what we've done here is using 2019 ACS data, looking at the number of people who break into different income groups, different income cohorts, match the range of housing units and their prices that people of that would be equivalently matched to people of that particular income stratum, and then compare the two numbers. So we might have, well, if you look at the line, it may be a little bit hard to see depending on how big your screen is. But if you look at the line that says the second row in that chart, this is looking at people with an income range of $25,000 to $50,000 of annual income. And in Salina, according to the ACS, there are about 5,100 households in that income range. Now, if we looked at the number of housing units that are paired with people in that income range that would be ideally affordable to them, because they have prices between house values between $60,000 and $125,000, or rents between about $500 and $1,000. There are about 8,900 units in that range. And so that's where you see this kind of weird number of an oversupply of 3,820 units. Now you could look at that and say, well, we don't have an affordable housing problem. But what it's telling us is that there are higher income households that are occupying lower cost housing. And so it's a mismatch. It's hard to tell people they're not paying enough for housing, but that's in a way kind of what's happening. It indicates that many households in Salina are paying a relatively small percentage of their incomes for housing because of this mismatch. it also shows us that housing in general in Salina is undervalued, which was a finding of Live Salina, an explanation for some of the lack of production that we're sometimes experiencing. Now, if you look at the other end of the scale, there are fewer units than available in some of these higher or middle ranges than we have people who can afford to live either by renting or by buying in those ranges. So that suggests that there's a move-up market or a more middle income market that could be opened up. And if that began to get produced, then some of the lower cost or lower priced houses would be, or housing units would become more available to as starter homes or for other populations. So what does this tell us in general? One is that there are opportunities for move-up housing. It's a good thing because you can't build a house anymore that's in $120,000 to $130,000 or $140,000 range, unless it's a townhouse or an unusual kind of construction. This is why we've got such a huge overall affordable housing problem in the country. We can conclude that in general, housing in the city is relatively undervalued, which is something that we found in the earlier study, and that production, even of market rate units, is a significant challenge. So we're just not, we don't seem to be producing housing in that, or at least enough housing in that sort of attainable range. So it's all kind of weird. It's not a pattern that's unusual at all, but in fact we find it in most non-metropolitan areas. But it's it is suggestive of a way out of some of the affordable housing issues.
You know, this is Commissioner Franz again, if I might interrupt. Explain what you mean when you say housing is undervalued.
Means that if you looked at a neighborhood, and I'm thinking about one like the Centennial Park neighborhood, just because we've done in Live Salina a lot of work on that, you'll see that the prices, the value, sales value of houses in that neighborhood are probably right now in $110,000 to $120,000 range. If you put a neighborhood like that somewhere else, those houses might be worth $50,000 more.
So it really is the asking price or the sales price of the houses, when you say undervalued, they are below what they should be.
Yeah, they're below what the replacement value would be.
I have a hard time getting my head around that, because that is just the opposite of what I think our natural perception is.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it isn't so true of new neighborhoods, but it is true of older neighborhoods. But yeah, excellent. It's an excellent question. We will be, like I said, for our next time together next month, we'll be looking in more detail at the single family market, at that market, with some geographic examples, and I think it's going to show you what this all kind of means. And the interesting thing is that you might have a family living in that neighborhood. I mean, people live in neighborhoods that they choose to live in, but living in that neighborhood could afford another neighborhood or afford a more expensive house, but they're occupying that kind of unit. Again, that sounds really weird, because people. I mean, my house is probably, since it's all paid out, it's definitely cheaper than I could afford. But I'm not about to move until I have to, or I get carried out or something like that. So Yeah, it's an observation of the market and not necessarily saying, well, sorry, folks, you got to move so that you can make room for somebody else. It's just a comparison for that helps to inform policy a little bit. Next slide, please. So now, here in this slide, we're taking the new development that we are projecting to happen and distributing it across different price ranges. And basically here we're assuming that the relative income distribution of new population, of new growth, is going to be fairly much the same as we've had in the past. We inflate it, of course, but the affordability categories and the overall relative distribution of income groups, we're assuming that it stays pretty much the same. So in other words, we're not expecting an influx of millionaires between 2020 and 2030. It'll be the same kind of relative income distribution as we have now. And you can see what this all means. So the biggest single chunk of that market, of that future market for single family, is under $225,000. But those are very hard to deliver as far as new construction goes without significant programming and assistance. And we'll look at what that means a little bit next time. But if we look at the middle ranges, that is people from $225,000 to $300,000, which the market actually can deliver, there's a significant need there for, and then even when we get into what's now the higher end, over $300,000, there's also a pretty significant need. When we look at rental markets, you'll see that we generally will wind up putting a larger percentage of the more moderate income population in rental units than we do in owner-occupied units because of the cost of new owner-occupied construction. So when we look at rents that are under $1,000, and as you'll see in a few minutes, that is a moderate rent in terms of new construction. Of that 620 units, about about 500 of those are going to be under $1,000. And I'm seeing another problem with the numbers here. Now I have to see what's going on. But I'm sorry, I'm looking at the totals there. But there's still an issue with the spreadsheet. Okay, so next slide. So here we have a sample of existing larger rental units, rental projects in the city. So these are looking at anything that we could discern that's over about 30 to 40 units in a single place. And with little exception, there's nothing available in any of those bigger developments. You can see that there's housing stock in that's available that's available in the Ridges, which is our biggest single rental project. But most of the rest of the existing significantly sized units don't have any vacancy. So that already points to a very significant rental shortage. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and when we get into looking at the finances of those, this is going to be, this will start to make sense, is that our typical density of rental development is about 13 to 14 units per acre. So as we've studied a sort of hypothetical rental project, that's what we come up with. And that generally the market rents in Salina right now are somewhere between 75 cents a square foot per month and $1 a square foot per month. So, so keep that number in mind. We used to think that $1 a square foot per month, which would correspond to say $1,000 a month for a 1,000 square foot apartment, would be pretty high rent. But those days are really more or less gone. And yet, one issue is people are used to paying lower rents, and when you get above $1,000, it feels pretty expensive. But you can see that that in these this sample, which I think is pretty much everything that isn't assisted living, which is a different market entirely, is pretty much unavailable right now or has a waiting list. So next slide. So our summary findings are that, first of all, from our investigation of what's out there in the market now, we have very low vacancy. We have market rent of about $1 a square foot. There's not been very much in the way of recent development, Lee Lofts being the newest. A lot of the inventory is restricted to seniors. And our typical residential density is in that range of 13 to 14 units per acre, although the Ridges goes up higher than that, goes up to 20, almost 20 units per acre. Okay, so any questions so far? Great. Yeah, and I apologize for the spreadsheet or arithmetic errors, but we'll get those fixed and get those numbers corrected and back out to you as soon as I can. Okay, so now let's look at one of the problems that we are dealing with right now, and that is an analysis of rental housing and what goes into it and what it costs to produce it. So in our hypothetical example here, we are looking at a 50-unit project, just kind of this is a generic development. At 13 units per acre, that means we would need a piece of property a little bit less than 4 acres to accommodate that. You can see the assumptions about gross residential and net residential area, because we're assuming that our average unit's going to be about 900 square feet. Might be a little bit generous, but again, that will be a very generous 1-bedroom or a pretty average 2-bedroom unit. And that we have to provide for on-street parking, and we do that at about 1.75 stalls per unit. So now we go to, what does it cost to develop this? Okay, well, first of all, we have to buy a parcel of land. So according to our friends in the Community Development Department, to buy a square foot of improved land, that is with all urban services. So we're not accounting for infrastructure that's already built. It's about $4 a square foot. So our land cost for that site is about $670,000. And if we divide that up into 50 units, that's about $13,000 a unit, which is pretty much about right in the market. Figuring building construction at $150 a square foot, and that's what contractors tell us it's costing right now. That number comes out to for hard construction to be about $7.9 million. Now, keep in mind that contractors' profit is usually embedded in that number. So, this is not a developer's fee or anything but it includes the profit related to the actual construction of the unit. Parking is an added site improvement, so that usually costs about $5 a square foot. And we figure as a rule of thumb with parking, drive aisles, landscaping, driveways, those kinds of things, about 350 square feet per stall. That's another $153,000 in our 50-unit project. Other site development, namely turf, trees, and so forth, can average out to be a couple dollars a square foot. And then we add in a 5% construction contingency. So our hard cost for building that particular 50-unit project is about $9.5 million. Not that far from $200,000 a unit, which is a lot more than we were used to when even a project like the Ridges might have been built. Then we add soft costs into that. So soft costs are development fees, architects, engineers, testing, finance fees, all those interim fine, all that kind of stuff. And that, as a rule of thumb, is about 25% of hard costs. So our total development cost, everything considered, is about $11.9 million to build a 50-unit project. So you're already beginning to see part of the problem. Now let's go to the next slide. Now, how are these projects financed? Well, usually it's by some combination of equity and debt. Equity being people who are investing in property primarily for tax benefits. So to give you an example of what that means, let's say that we have heard a lot about what we call LIHTC, or low-income housing tax credit developments. And a LIHTC project that is 100% low and moderate income provides a 9% tax credit to an investor over each year for a 10-year period. So keep in mind that a tax credit is effectively, if you need the tax credit, cash in your pocket. It's not like a tax deduction. It's actually money off your tax liability. So let's say that I am wealthy enough that I have $100,000 to put into equity in a low-income housing tax credit project, and I've got a pretty big income tax liability. Every year, I am able to take 9% of that investment, or $9,000, off of my income tax liability as a result of my investment in that low-income housing tax credit project. So effectively, if I'm in the right tax bracket, I get $9,000 a year on my $100,000 investment, or 9% every year for 10 years. And then at the end of 10 years, or actually 15 years, when that project sells to somebody else, then I get my appreciated value back out of it as well. It's not a bad investment. And so I'm not so worried about whether that project is making money or not. Now, in this example, I have assumed for argument's sake that this is not a LIHTC project, and the investors in this may or may not, but may want a 5% cash on cash annual return, in addition to the appreciation that they're recovering on that development. So we factored that into our little pro forma example here. So that means that the rest of the money, 70%, is financed by debt. A good interest term, even now, is 4.5% for a commercial project like this. A reasonable loan term for permanent financing would be 25 years. And then I've shown a couple of assumptions about construction financing that gets loaded into the cost of money later on. But for our purposes today, we won't even deal with that. So that's how my little project here is going to get financed. So the next slide is going to show us some interesting stuff. So on this project, assuming that that Microsoft Excel has not failed me. 4.5% on, which is not necessarily a good assumption, 4.5% on a 25-year note is going to produce annual debt service of about $557,000. My O&M, operations and maintenance, is going to be, in this example, $250 a square foot every year. That's another $132,000, especially since the project is new. The property taxes, Saline County's consolidated tax rate appears to be 1.37% of assessed property value. And then I add in a return on equity. In my case here, I'm expecting this thing to pay me 5% per year. That may be kind of unrealistic, but there it is. And that's going to generate another $179,000 drain on cash flow on this project. That means that I need, in order to make up all of these fixed annual costs, an income from rents of a little under $1 million on my project, on my 986,000. If I now divide that by the leasable area, not the common area, but by the leasable area, and it's interesting that there are new developments that, for a variety of reasons, and this is one of them, are reducing the amount of common area. That is hallway space, public space, other things that don't produce revenue in their developments. My leasable area is 45,000. So I'm looking for a yield of $21.93 per square foot per year. If I divide that by 12 to get the monthly rent equivalent, that's $1.83. If I multiply that by 900 to see what the rent's going to be on my 900 square foot unit, it's going to be about $1,647. That's going to be considered to be pretty high in Salina. And although there are people who can afford to do that, and it's not that unusual in other places by any means. In fact, if you're trying to do this in, say, Los Angeles, where my kids live, this would be dirt cheap because their rents are about twice that high, even for something of this size. That's what the number winds up being. So we know that if these assumptions, which are pretty normal assumptions, with some are valid, and I think they are, and they've been sort of vetted with people around the city. We are looking at new construction that is significantly above the market rate that people are now used to paying in Salina, and hence things have to be done, at least in the short term, to help reduce that cost. Any questions there so far?
So you said specifically just now that those are things that need to be done in the short term. Do you see that as once these units are up and performing, that they won't require some sort of subsidization in the future? That is a very valid question. The answer to it is I don't know. That the market may mature and develop to the point that there's more there are higher rents that are out there and people are used to paying those, and so as a result, this isn't so far above the housing market. It is really interesting, by the way, and this gets into national housing trends, that right now across the country, there is a distinct shortage in single-family housing stock and a distinct surplus of rental housing. Not necessarily affordable rental housing, but higher-end rental housing, because a lot of construction that's taken place around the country, including in a city like mine, which is Omaha, there's been
a very large amount of, say, downtown housing development or other higher cost market rate development, and it is in many cases turning into a surplus. Salina's problem is not that. Salina has not really participated in this rental housing boom, nor have a lot of smaller towns and medium-sized cities like yours. So it's something that you'll read about, but you'll read about it more in the New York Times than in local newspapers.
Marty, Commissioner Hoppick here. On
Hi.
your ROI, you show a 5%. Isn't it typical that individuals that are investing in this type of property are looking more like for an 8 to 10% return?
Not if they've got tax liabilities that they're trying to depreciate it
Okay,
against.
but you're talking about, you're not talking about a straight out investment without any,
Right.
okay.
Yeah. That and also in these cases, the equity that's going to make the situation look even worse too. But yeah, I mean if you're getting 5% per year and then the building appreciates and it's sold in 5 to 7 years and you're accumulating that, your internal rate of return is going to be higher than that. So you look at it from that kind of perspective. The interesting problem with LIHTC projects is that they have to remain in they need to remain in low income occupancy for 15 years. So as a result of that, the annual return on those projects without any additional cash on cash payment is 9%. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide. So now we've done a little bit of an analysis on the different things that can be done to reduce that rent, or different assumptions that could be made. So, for example, if this same project had tax abatement, then you could reduce that rent by at your current county tax rate by 22 cents per square foot. If the construction cost is reduced, if there's a more efficient way of building, say going from $150 to $125 a square foot, which is not something you've got control of, that could reduce it by 13 cents. The higher density does not seem to have a whole lot of impact, which kind of surprised me a bit. If the ROI is decreased or deferred and ballooned to the end on sale, that has a huge savings per square foot. If land is free, it saves 6 cents. If the interest rate is subsidized, that has another major impact. So some of these things that we normally think are really significant incentives sometimes aren't so much. And of the things that are actually within the city's control or programs control, things like interest rate lowering or tax abatement really can have the most significant annual impact on rents. And then, of course, the LIHTC tax benefits, which really get rid of the need for a cash-on-cash ROI, really do have very significant effect on the cost of the unit to the renter.
Commissioner Franz here. All of this presumes that the site that's being built on has all services in place.
That's correct.
So
Yeah.
if the site is undeveloped and you have to go in, you have to build the streets and water and sewer lines and all of the services that go with a developable
Right.
site, I presume that would change this number quite a bit.
Yeah, Yeah, if you, so then we would, and it's a good idea to do that. If we ran a sort of greenfield simulation, then that's going to add to that cost. And that's where density really comes in, because density, if you've got to provide new services, that's one of the reasons why density seems to have so little an impact here, because we're assuming those services are all in there. But if you're providing new services to a project, to an area to build multifamily development, if you're building that development at, say, 20 to 25 units per acre versus 13 to 14 units per acre, that's a significant savings in the initial cost of construction. And so in greenfield site, higher density does make a significant difference. In sites that are already served and that cost is already in the ground, it makes a smaller difference, other than being more efficient from a variety of other points of view.
One of the other deliverables, or part of the deliverables of this project, is getting kind of one of these pro formas for a couple of different scenarios, Commissioner Franz. Just based on time and how quickly we're trying to move that along, we thought this would be the most pertinent one to bring forward because of the multifamily projects we've talked about. And if somebody wanted to move fast, likely you would be doing that on a piece of ground that was already prepped. But definitely that whole with infrastructure, without infrastructure scenario for multifamily, for probably something like townhouses, and then possibly looking at fourplexes or even a tower complex is something that we're working through right now.
Right. Yeah, so we're going to be looking at a variety of different products and how those work economically and what they look like in the market.
But we wanted to address this one, especially in the second one, because I think of the consistent thing that we've been hearing both as the city and as a community is multifamily is we just can't make the numbers work. And so we wanted to be able to start to look at that question of why can't it work? Where are those costs hitting that bottom line, and what does that number look like?
And you can see from this demonstration why that's happening, where those costs are.
Well, and what this slide is starting to get us to think about is whether it's with infrastructure, without infrastructure, townhomes, towers, fourplexes, how do these economic incentives make a difference on that overall cost? You know, if we get back to what is an individual paying for rent a month, is 1,600-ish bucks a month possible? Well, if we take 22 cents off a square foot versus 3 cents off a square foot versus 9 cents off a square foot, how do the economic incentives we're putting forward make an impact on a project? And knowing we can't be all things to all projects, and that whatever incentives we put forward will have an impact on our bottom line, this starts to help us see, as we develop policies for these different incentives, what those impacts will be on projects and the types of projects they'll impact.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just looking, and we debate about a lot of different economic incentive policies and applications for a variety of projects. And maybe I'm being pessimistic, but I'm not seeing that it makes a tremendous amount of difference there. I mean, 22 cents savings on monthly rent.
Per square foot.
Per square foot.
Oh, per square foot. Okay, there you go. All right.
Per
Thank
square
you very
foot.
much. I was
Per
like,
square foot
that's
per
not gonna
month.
help us at all.
Mayor
Yeah, it
Hodges-
makes a pretty big difference.
Almost 200 bucks a month.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Mayor
Thank you.
Hodges, just so you don't feel bad, I had the same impression when
I'm
I first
sorry,
saw
I-
that table.
We should have put savings per square foot on monthly rent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
so
you.
multiply that by 900 and then you, then it's a little bit different.
Yeah, in fact, that 22
I'm-
cents on a 900 square foot
I'm-
apartment comes out to 198 bucks.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it is a big deal, actually.
Okay.
One question, that this is based on a greenfield development, is that correct?
No,
No.
it's based on an open, a vacant site with services.
Okay, so it's vacant with services, all right.
Correct. Mhm.
So the potential lower cost of, well, do you figure land is cheaper with greenfield or in town?
It's cheaper, well, good question. It's cheaper per square foot for raw land, but then you have to provide the services. Then you have to provide the utilities and infrastructure. So it's actually more well, it's more expensive. It's actually kind of 6 of one and half a dozen of another, because the $4 a square foot cost for the improved land includes the infrastructure cost.
Right, because what I was wondering down the road was, does the cost of putting the utilities in exceed the savings in purchase price of the land?
Theoretically, no, because that number, the cost of the infrastructure, should be cooked into the price of the land that so you might be paying, say, $15,000 an acre for raw land, but you might be paying, I don't know, you might be paying a couple $100,000 an acre to put the infrastructure in.
And I do think it's worth noting too, when we talk about scenarios of, more traditional owner occupied, smaller homes or duplexes or townhomes versus rental in, 50 units in some kind of fourplexes or eightplexes, you're taking up a lot more land, and the internal drive system for an apartment complex can be fairly compact, and you can get a whole lot of units.
Right.
If you're spreading out over a number of acres for, let's say, 50 to 100 units, you're going to have a lot more road to install. And so that cost too of spreading that infrastructure out over a piece of property versus kind of that more compact scenario and something denser will definitely be noticeable in raw land for sure.
That's right.
Mike
Yeah,
Sprague here.
yeah, exactly right.
Mike Sprague here. Just to clarify, the scenario, the assumptions for this scenario are $4 a square foot for site development. So that includes land acquisition and infrastructure. So if those numbers are in the right ballpark, that should account for greenfield development, correct?
Yeah, it's $4 a square foot. What we're assuming here is that we're building on a site that's got services. So it's $4 a square foot, which includes the cost of what's already in the ground. So it doesn't have to be repeated. Then the site development and parking costs are on top of that. So if you're looking at something like land plus site plus parking, then it's going to come out to be something like $7 or $8 a square foot.
Commissioner Franz here again, if that being the case, if that $4 includes the underlying infrastructure, by the time you get to the influence on rents, it may be kind of a wash as a greenfield versus already developed site?
Yes, theoretically, it would be a wash. Theoretically, somebody's going to establish a value on improved land that presumably includes the price of the infrastructure that went into it that's establishing that price. So you'll be paying something like at $4 a square foot, $160,000 an acre for the improved land, and you might be paying $15,000 an acre for quote greenfield land, that is raw land without improvements.
Well, and what we're not talking about with the greenfield development either is if, particularly if it's right there on the edge of the city, if there's some type of specials that are waiting to be applied to those properties when they get developed, that isn't even cooked into any of these scenarios yet, which we do have some of those in areas where we expanded our system.
That's right. And specials help specials help because that's not getting financed exactly off, well, it is getting financed off the rent, but it isn't financed by the developer at their private rates. It's being financed ultimately by the rents of people who are paying the rent that includes the assessment charge.
Another added variable for greenfield sites is perimeter roads, and our
Yes.
policy is it applies
Yes.
to perimeter road
Yes.
development.
Yeah, yes.
So Commissioner Franz, if that goes back to your question of, is this all a wash if we're looking at greenfield versus infill development? I don't think it is. Because if you look at the majority of our available greenfield sites, you're likely gonna look at some kind of some road impact fee like Mike was just mentioning, or we're gonna have some remaining specials related to water and sewer extensions that a lot of times will need to be considered. So there will definitely be additional costs for greenfield.
And then you've got your basic cost of municipal services too, on top of that. So fire protection, public safety, things like that get stretched out a little bit farther. And so those get factored in. But again, that's on the city operating side, not necessarily at the developer's cost. So Lauren, you've got another slide, I think, in there.
Yeah. Well,
There
I
it
think
is.
this is where, thanks, Marty. We just wanted to kind of wrap things up. And from some of those numbers that we've looked at, some of them are things we do, and some of them are things that we haven't done, could do, maybe can't do. So if we kind of divide those out, tax abatement or some type of increment system, we can do through RHID, we can do through NRA or IRB. And there's slight differences in each of those, but in general, they kind of work the same way. And that's getting to some type of way of dealing with property tax. Reducing construction costs, much of that is out of our control, but there is a uniqueness to IRB that sales tax on construction materials can be eliminated through the IRB. So that may be one way to impact construction costs. SRA would be able to waive permit fees. That's one way to help in certain cost areas, and something we do and can do. Special assessment district, I would say that Salina's never tried this. It's not very common, but CIDs, for instance, are a method for doing this. You see them more often in kind of urbanized mixed use areas. And that's by putting a specialty tax over that district. It's being collected, which then goes to do something. And in this case, it would be to emphasize housing in a certain way. We haven't done it that way before, but it is something we have an adopted CID policy and can do CIDs. And then we do have the land bank for certain scenarios where even though we haven't pushed through a policy, we do have a legal and existing bank. And if something came up where the commission said, you know, look, we need to move this particular property into the bank, either to hold it so it's not collecting taxes, or we need to wash it of taxes because it's in foreclosure or had tax issues, we could do that. And that's a tool in our toolbox. Of the other ones that Marty mentioned that we're definitely going to be looking more at, that would be things that are coming up in presentation 3. And I should mention too, not just need to know more of, some of them are things that aren't in our wheelhouse. We can support them through letters of recommendation, like the MIH, which is Moderate Income Housing, which is a grant program through Kansas Housing Resource Corporation. That program's all of them. It's money out of the Kansas State Trust Fund for housing. We can support it, but we don't do it. Kind of like LIHTC, we can offer that support, but we aren't the ones who are granting that designation. Historic tax credits, I think just about every commissioner has experience with that. Again, it's something we can support and help with that process, but we aren't that final decision maker on how that gets awarded. But that is something that can be coupled with, like MIH, these other things that are in our toolbox to make some pretty powerful economic incentives. Things like higher density, free land, I think are things that we could maybe look at and are possible techniques. Deferred cash ROI, interest subsidies, and longer term loans definitely, I don't think off the bat seem like there's something in our wheelhouse, but part of the research that Marty and his team are doing between now and our April meeting is how are municipalities doing those things? And if so, what does that look like? And then lastly is just a big old other, you know, part of looking at our neighbors and looking at things outside the box is definitely part of this. Because like I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of other communities that are in very similar situations to ours. And grappling with this problem has significant impacts through many areas of the community, not just our economic growth, but our long-term growth, even if we want to keep our current employment. So with that, I'll just remind everybody that we have the third presentation in April, and then the fourth one is in May. And those are the first Monday study sessions. And those will start at 2, because I think Marty's going to have quite a bit more material to go through. And those will be opportunities definitely for the commission to give policy feedback and direction. So we wanted to make sure we had enough time for that.
Right.
Ms. Driscoll, if that is the case, that you would like to get some policy feedback at that point, would it be possible to include that information in our packet when it goes out on Thursdays? It's always helpful for me, I can't speak for the other commissioners, but to have a few days to take a look at that and absorb it and have better input and better questions when we're here on Monday.
Of course, Madam Mayor.
Commissioner Hoppick here. And I appreciate this, and we're looking at this study going through May. How do you foresee us moving forward if something comes to us prior to the May meeting? I mean,
Staff was under the impression following the last study session that we had, that if viable projects that could work with known tools, economic tools that we had been presented, that you would like us to bring those forward to you for the commission to look at further.
okay, well, I just wanted to make sure of that because
Yeah, that would certainly be our recommendation, given
from a
the
time-
need coming.
from a timing standpoint, trying to get something done before the middle of 2022, you know, there is a time frame involved to keep this moving forward if someone has a project. So,
You know,
Thank
for what it's worth, commissioners, staff's having conversations with developers that are indicating interest, and we're having conversations about these type of tools and a little bit more detail in terms of what are eligible expenses and how they might work. And so we're having ongoing conversations about what's their vision for their project, what's their proposal look like, and can we get it framed up in a way to bring it back to you for your consideration. So we're going to work on this policy question and the housing study update, as well as having ongoing conversations with developers that indicate interest.
This Commissioner Davis, and I'm not to sound like the broken record, but I'm hoping at some point between now and then we'll also have had our strategic planning session, because I mean this is one of the big topics that
It
we
is.
should be
There's a
discussing.
couple of others that are stacking up along the same lines, but yes. We're trying to,
I'm
trying to
sure.
move forward as well.
Absolutely. And
Thank you.
yeah, we definitely need to do that. There's some other projects that are kind of holding fire too, that we really need to sit down and have conversations about.
Well, another factor that's a recent added twist is the federal legislation about stimulus and what that might mean locally and what eligible expenses might be. And that's a whole interrelated conversation, and it's definitely a strategic planning conversation. So staff's trying to get a sense of the legislation as it evolves and what that's going to look like for us.
Thank you. I do see that we have several members of the public. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to ask a question really quickly, because we probably only have about 5 minutes to deal with that. First, are there any further questions or comments from the commission? Okay. And hopefully if we don't get with you today, you can email us at citycommission@salina.org. You can reach out to us, or hopefully by starting future study sessions at 2 o'clock, we'll have a little bit more time to take public input. Is there anyone that would like to speak briefly right now before we break for the regular meeting? Please raise your virtual hand. if you know how to do that on Zoom. And if you don't know how to do that on Zoom, turn on your camera and raise your physical hand, and Deputy City Manager Jacob Wood will unmute you so that you can participate.
Yeah, I don't see any at this time. Anybody in the room, though I don't know that we've asked the, okay, it doesn't look like anybody in the room wants to
Okay.
comment either, so.
All right, great. Well, Mr. Schuker, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Driscoll.
Okay.
Really appreciate.
Thank you. And I know it can be a little dry and there are a lot of numbers, but it is pretty interesting stuff. So I appreciate it and look forward to next month.
Great, so do we. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll adjourn the study session now and return to the open meeting here in about 8 minutes. Thank you.
He just stepped away to deal with the technical detail, but
Gotcha.
he says we're ready.
Okay, so we're good. All right, well, with that, I will go ahead and call the Monday, March 8th, 2021 Salina City Commission meeting to order and confirm with staff that the Kansas Open Meeting Act required notice has been properly provided.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Since we're doing a hybrid model today, we have commissioners both and the public and staff both physically in attendance and virtually. I would like to ask the folks that are physically in attendance at the meeting at the City County building to please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and we will follow that with a moment of silence. Thank you all very much. Thank you guys for leading that. With that, we'll go to City Manager Mike Scragg for a brief COVID update on the data and the trends in Salina over the past week.
Mayor Hodges, did you want to do a roll call also?
You know, one of these meetings, probably about January of 2022, I'm actually going to hit everything in the correct order. I think that's a brilliant idea, Commissioner Hoppick. Let's go ahead and do that roll call.
Mayor Hodges,
Here.
Commissioner Davis,
Here.
Commissioner Friend,
Here.
Commissioner Hoppick,
Here.
Commissioner Ryan.
Here.
Thank you. And thank you very much for catching that. Now we'll proceed to Mr. Scragg.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor Hodges. I'm going to try to verbally report to you some numbers on the key indicators that we've talked about before. And I would remind you that our data is based on Fridays, week to week. So these numbers are based on March 5th. In terms of new cases, there were 37 new cases. Going back prior weeks, there was 55 the week prior, 59 the week prior to that, 106 the week prior to that, and then almost 200 for the 2 weeks prior. So 37 currently compared to that prior kind of downward trend from 200 to 37. In terms of active cases, there's now 313. Going back prior weeks, that compares to 699, 1,179, 1,251, and a peak of about 1,855. In terms of total recovered, there's now 5,553 individuals recovered from COVID. That's an increase of 424. As of March 5th, there were 2 hospitalizations reported compared to 9 the week prior, 9 the week before that, 12, and a peak of about 34 in early January. Total deaths now total 106, and that was the same number last week. So there were no deaths in the intervening week's time. Going back week by week for the prior month, it would be 0, 2 the week prior, 2 the week before that, and then 7 the week before that. So I think that is an indication that the numbers are trending downward. I think I reported last week that Jason Tiller, the health director, will be in attendance virtually or in person, I'm not sure which, next week and be able to provide his perspective and be prepared to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scragg. And that's something I would encourage the members of the governing body as well as members of the public to be thinking about those questions and to please don't hesitate to submit those either to, for the public, the City Commission at salina.org email address, or for the commissioners to submit those to City Manager Scragg so he can pass those on to Mr. Tiller and he can be prepared with the information that we would like to receive from him. So at any rate, that will be at that COVID update from County Health Department Director Jason Tiller will be at next week's meeting. And in the meantime, I would just like to thank everyone for continuing to mask up and to maintaining social distancing, and to encourage everyone to please sign up and receive the vaccination when you have the opportunity to do so. Because I think the last few weeks are showing us that all of that can work together, but we've all got to do our part to mitigate the risk. So thank you very much. We don't have any awards and proclamations today, so that will bring us to Citizens Forum. Citizens Forum is an opportunity for members of the public to speak on any item that does not appear on today's agenda. We would ask that you clearly state your name, where you're from, and limit your remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, I will turn it over to Deputy City Manager Jacob Wood to go over the procedure about how you raise your virtual hand. And of course, we will be glad to hear from anyone who's actually in physical attendance in the City County building today.
So Deputy City Manager Jacob Wood here. It doesn't actually look like we have any members of the public that are online, but we do have several people in the room. So I won't go through the whole list since we don't have anybody from the public online, but we can do the folks in the room if somebody wants to step up to the podium and state your name.
Hi, good afternoon, Mayor Hodges and City Commissioners. My name is Stephen Howe, and I reside at 2202 Melrose Lane. On January 11th of this year, I was sworn in to serve as a state representative for Kansas House District 71, which covers East Salina and Saline County. I currently serve on 3 committees: Federal and State Affairs, Transportation, and Insurance and Pensions. The Kansas legislature is currently at the midpoint of this legislative session, just having completed turnaround week. Because the session is scheduled for 90 days, the legislature has certain deadlines to help keep us on schedule. And so this turnaround week is the last week in which non-exempt bills can be passed out of their House of Origin. So last week, the House of Representatives passed 63 different bills, which will now be considered by the Senate or a conference committee. So my main purpose for being here is just to formally introduce myself. I haven't really had the opportunity since being sworn in to come and visit with you all. And I want you to know that it is my desire to work with you, city staff, the county government, and the local school districts. Together, we can help make Salina and Saline County a better place to work, operate a business, raise a family, or even retire. As a state representative, it is important for me to have citizen input, especially as policy is being considered in the legislature. The best way to contact me is by email, which is stephen.howe@house.ks.gov. My office phone in Topeka is 785-296-7642. I would be glad to provide that contact information to city staff so it can be distributed to the city commission. But in parting, I just want to say thank you for your service to our community as well. And don't ever assume that I know everything that's going on. I definitely rely on citizen input as I make decisions on different bills before the legislature. So with that, I wish you all a prosperous and healthy rest of your week and in the weeks and months ahead. I think there's a bright future for Salina and Saline County, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Howe. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit the City Commission meeting, and I think we're all looking forward to getting to meet you face to face. And thank you for all of your hard work on the citizens of Salina's behalf, and best wishes to you on your new legislative career, and congratulations on your committee appointments. I'm sure you'll be working very hard on our behalf, and we thank you for that. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Dalton, the city of Salina. I would like to ask Mayor Hodges that when do you expect that you will lift, you and the commission lift your mask mandate? The state house and the Kansas State House doesn't even require you to have a mask on. It's just more of a, they wish you would, but they're not forcing it. And I heard now that we're writing tickets to businesses, it's kind of ridiculous to send law enforcement to write tickets when they have other stuff to be doing. Look at our crime rate, and you're gonna force law enforcement to go waste their time on writing tickets for mask mandate violations. I just think that's ridiculous.
Thank you, Mr. McDowell. I would agree. It is ridiculous. It's unfortunate that we're having to waste law enforcement officer man and woman power on writing tickets when it's such an easy thing to comply with our mask ordinance. And I'm sure that we'll be reviewing this in the weeks ahead, the governing body as a whole, in consultation with both city staff and county staff and Salina Regional Health Center's direction. So thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
It doesn't look like there's anybody else, Mayor Hodges.
Thank you very much. We don't have any public hearings or items scheduled for a certain time, so we'll proceed to the consent agenda.
Item 6.1, approve the minutes of March 1, 2021. Item 6.2, consider awarding contract for microsurfacing.
Are there any items that a commissioner would like to have removed from the consent agenda? And if not, then I would accept a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Mayor Hodges, I move that we approve consent agenda items 6.1 and 6.2.
Commissioner Ryan, second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda as presented, items 6.1 and 6.2. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis.
Aye.
Commissioner France.
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick.
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan.
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye. Motion passes 5-0. We'll move on to administration, item 7.1.
Item 7.1, report on bids received for vehicle and equipment purchases for 2021.
Right, Ms. Pack.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Commissioners. Debbie Pack, Director of Finance and Administration. As part of the 2021 budget, City Commission approved 33 vehicles and equipment items under the sub-CIP 2021 program. Today, we are bringing forward 25 items for your consideration. Staff has worked with Central Garage to complete specifications and put out bids. And we have brought forward those in several categories. So I'm just going to go over the categories. I'm not going to go over them item by item. In the first group, we're bringing forward a list of items that both came in under budget and that we are recommending that you award to the low bidder. The second group of items are items that came in under budget, but we're not recommending that they go to the lowest bidder for different reasons. Most of those are that the lowest bidder did not meet specifications. The third group of items that we're bringing forward are items that are over budget. However, we are still recommending awarding those to the low bidders. I will make a note on this page, in this group, the last item for the two convenience area roll-off boxes. The recommended bidder is actually Downing, not Technical International. We caught that typo today when we were reviewing some purchase order information. The next group is a group that we did receive a bid, however, it did not meet specifications, so we're requesting that we rebid that item. And the last group is an item that did not receive any bids, so we are asking for, we're making a recommendation to also rebid that item. In addition to these items that were approved in the 2021 sub-CIP, in December of 2020, the police vehicle was wrecked and rendered a total loss. So after negotiations with the insurance company and all of those related costs were paid, we got it to a net amount of $30,603.25 that is available to cover the purchase of a new vehicle. Since that met with the timing of this proposal, we reached out to Long MacArthur, who was the low bidder on the other 3 vehicles that were scheduled, and they are willing to extend their vehicle price for this purchase. So we are recommending that we award the purchase of a 4th police vehicle to replace this using the same bid price that Long MacArthur provided. The summary of the fiscal note is that all of these budgets, with the exception of sanitation, came in under budget. Even if we go out for rebid on the 2 items that we recommended, they still should come in under budget. In the recommended action, I did provide you with a summary list of what we are recommending for each of these items, just to make it a little bit easier to look at. Just as another note to reminder, the 4th to the last item for the roll-off boxes, that recommended bidder is Downing, not Technology International. So basically, a recap is we're asking to award 24 of these items and rebid 2 items. Staff identifies the following options for City Commission: approve the purchase of the vehicles and equipment as recommended, authorize staff to proceed with the purchases and rebids, and authorize the city manager to sign contracts with the selected vendors. You could approve these purchases with amendments as you see fit. You could postpone consideration of this action and provide us with additional information that you might need, or you could choose not to approve the purchase of the vehicles at this time. Staff recommends option number 1. And I do have John Doerr, our central garage supervisor, with us today if we have questions about any of the specific bids or the bid process. So we would stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Pack. Are there any members of the commission who have questions for Ms. Pack?
Commissioner Hoppick, and I don't really have a question about this. I just, this probably goes back to last year. Do we have deferred items from last year because of COVID and not knowing what our budget was? I know we put off some purchases. Will we be addressing some of that later in the year, or?
We actually recommended to staff that if they had an item on last year, that they resubmit it this year. So some of these items were actually items from last year.
Okay.
We wouldn't anticipate addressing those separately, to my knowledge.
Yeah, at least out of this current budget, and one of the things that we're talking about is going back and providing kind of an update of where the sales tax fund stands and whether there, item by item, category by category, there's a balance there. So if anything, we might have an opportunity going into the 2022 budget to kind of do our annual appropriation and account for any additional savings that we've, deferred expenditures, maybe I should say, that we've realized.
So, yeah, I was pleased, Commissioner Hoppick, I guess, since we're still virtual, some we should say who we are, but yeah, I was pleased with the number of bids that came in under the budgeted amount. That was good. That's all I had.
Anyone else? If not, we'll open it up for public comment. And again, I'd remind anyone who would like to comment to please state your name and where you're from.
I don't see any at this time, Mayor Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. With that, I'll bring it back to the commission for action. I do have one question for Ms. Pack. Do we need to include in the motion that Downing is the recommended bidder on the roll-off boxes, or have we acknowledged that sufficiently now so we can just go ahead to approve the purchase without mentioning them specifically?
I would prefer that you mention them specifically. I think that'll make it clearer. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Hoppick, I move we approve purchase of 2021 vehicles and equipment as recommended, authorizing staff to proceed with purchases and rebids, and authorize the city manager to sign contracts with selected vendors, correcting the blue sheet and making note that the 2 convenience area roll-off boxes are being purchased from Downing.
Commissioner Davis, second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the vehicle and equipment purchases for 2021. Could I have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner France,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye. Thank you. That vote passes 5-0, and that will bring us to item 7.2.
Item 7.2, request for permission to submit application for SAFER grant.
Chief Royce.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Commissioners. I come for you today to request your approval for the fire department to submit a grant application with the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA for what's more commonly known as a SAFER grant, which stands for Staffing and Adequate Fire and Emergency Response. This is a federal grant that usually cost shares departments to increase their staffing, and this is the first time they've ever had a no-cost share option. Most of the time it's 100%, 75%, 25% is how they usually handle this. This grant will cover 100% of all personnel costs and benefits for 36 months or 3 years. The total cost is $845,008 or $460 would be what the grant would be a request for. The department's seen a steady increase in overtime and callback expenses in the past several years. As you may recall from my presentation a couple of weeks ago, I showed you a slide that showed what our daily minimum staffing was of 25, and it has been that way since 2005. During that same period of time, in the last 16 years, we've seen a 77% increase in call volume. In 2013, we added a fourth ambulance, which did increase service to the citizens. However, we did it without adding any additional personnel. So we basically had 4 people on 2 of the engines, and we took those 4 people, or those 2 extra people, and used that crew to staff the 4th ambulance, which is Medic 4 right now. This is a very competitive grant, and if awarded, it will allow us 3 years to monitor and see how the additional staffing affects our overtime and callback budgets. The intent being the possibility that in that 3 years, the department would be able to budget for the added personnel with most of the savings from the overtime. Some of the causes for the overtime, particularly in 2019, were we had 9 service-connected injuries, which is a high amount of injuries. We had 10 last year in 2020, so we are seeing an increase in injuries, and these are fireground injuries, work comp injuries. We also hired 4 new recruits that year, so at one time during 2019, we were actually down on our staffing, which required additional personnel. And we also had 3 personnel in paramedic class at that time, all in 2019. Fire service and fire department is a little bit different than any other department. I think I've said it before that we always work in crews or teams. Some departments can get by without 1 person a shift or 2 people a shift, but anytime we get down below that 25-person minimum manning, we're taking apparatus and vehicles off track and declining our service level. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have regarding the grant.
Thank you, Chief Royce. Are there any questions from the commission? Commissioner Davis?
Hi, Chief Royce. Does your budget, you then have 3 years to plan to increase your budget to absorb the cost of these positions after the 3 years are up?
Yes, sir. But Mike Scragg here. I just want to be real clear. We've had conversations for quite some time about whether full-time staffing at regular rate would save enough overtime to offset adding that staff, and we've never attempted that. This represents an opportunity, a pilot project of sorts, to use grant funding to increase staffing levels. The expectation would be that that 25 level that Chief Royce mentioned would still be the staffing level we're trying to maintain, but this would be an opportunity to see whether we realize a net break even or possibly savings by avoidance of overtime. At the end of that process, we would then have to size up what we've seen, whether it pays for itself, and whether we want to continue.
So if it did not pay for itself, do you politely drop those 4 positions, or do you just increase?
Yeah, there's enough turnover on a regular basis that I think we could get back to that staffing level through attrition rather than any type of layoffs.
All right, thank you.
Just one thing real quick, because it relates very closely to what Commissioner Davis just asked about. But another item that I hope that you'll take into consideration is the input from the firefighters themselves, whether having the additional staff and being able to reduce their overtime, if that's viewed as, a positive thing. And if, even if it doesn't quite work out on a cost basis, if we're seeing a lot more job satisfaction, fewer injuries, other benefits from being staffed at a higher level, I hope that that's something that we can take into consideration as well.
Sure, I think as we approach conclusion of the grant cycle, we'd come back, look at costs, look at staffing, and we'd make a strategic decision at that point. But I don't want to create the expectation that the presumption is that this is an $885,000 expense we're just going to budget into in full between now and then. We'd have to look at the financial performance as well as the intangibles.
Gotcha, thank you. Are there any other questions from the governing body?
Yeah, Commissioner Franz here. I do have several. When we do this, is this going to have affect the EMS overtime as well as the fire overtime? In other words, we have a certain amount of overtime in fire suppression that's related to firefighting or firefighters. There's also, and that's the big number, but in the EMS division, there's also a lot of callbacks, and that's where 80% of our calls are.
About 87%.
Yeah.
Right.
So is this going to reduce EMS overtime also?
That would be my hope. However, this is a fire-only grant. You cannot use this for EMS personnel. But people,
Okay.
The way the grant language says that it's for staffing of apparatus that more than 50 or 51% of the time, that would be their primary.
Okay,
But
so
it would help. It would help.
Okay. What kind of metrics does FEMA require? In other words, as we work through this grant, what are we going to have to tell them? What do they expect to see?
It's a 27-page application that I've been working on for about the last 2 weeks, just because I can't wait until the night before.
Sure,
It's pretty.
yeah.
There's some frustration on my part. We've submitted the last 3 years' worth of data, both in budget form and in call volume form. The frustration I have sometimes is I see Wichita, I see Kansas City, I see metro departments getting these SAFER grants that have 115, 125 people on duty a day, getting them repeatedly, year after year.
Yeah.
And the only reason I say that is because it's frustrating, because the intent of this program was for mid-sized departments like ours to benefit from just 4 additional people would make a big difference. So it's a very intensive, competitive, I don't know if you read the frequently asked questions. There's $360 million available. 10% will go to volunteer departments. They expect an awards of about 300 awards.
Okay. So have you talked to any of the departments who've got it? And I know smaller departments, Andover, I believe, has had it. Great Bend has had 1 or 2. What's their experience been?
Jealousy because of the 100% cost. They had to pony up some money.
Yeah.
All of them. This is the first time I've ever seen this.
But I guess the question is, have they achieved their objectives?
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, were their objectives to reduce overtime? Because
or growth. In Andover's case, it was growth. They were
Okay.
growing so they just couldn't keep up with the residential growth that they're seeing.
And we're going to look at this as a pilot project. The report says it could be. That leaves me wondering, is it or is it not?
I was tasked to look for alternatives to decrease my
Okay.
overtime, and I found this one.
Okay.
So,
And what do we expect to see? I mean, what is the targeted overtime at now, and where would we expect it to go? Because we're going to spend $300,000 a year. I'm just wondering what the offsetting savings might be.
right. Well,
And I know they're not going to be 300,000. Don't get me wrong, but I would like to know, if it's 10,000, that's very different than if it's 150.
sure. The numbers I presented in the blue sheet show you our daily assigned personnel as of today. 2 shifts have 28 personnel, and 1 shift has 27.
Right.
if awarded, I wanted to get 29 across the board on all three grants, or all
Okay.
three shifts. And the reason for that was we can drop down to 25 and still operate every piece of equipment we have. Our current allocation is 2 people off on scheduled leave per day, personal days, vacation. That gives us a 2-person buffer right off the bat. During the COVID situation, we actually dropped our daily minimum staffing down by 1 to assist in some overtime savings, which were effective. The point is, it gives the battalion chiefs and the department a lot of flexibility for the staffing model that they can resume. And then hopefully, with 2 people off, we have 2 people as a buffer. We don't have to call 2 people back to maybe take a transfer, or call 2 people back
Okay.
for fill in, right? As of right now, I have 3 people on long-term injury leave.
So how much of that overtime budget, and I believe it's at about 600,000 for this year, how much of that overtime budget goes for that sort of overtime as opposed to the regularly scheduled overtime that just comes in as a part of the regular schedule?
I don't know if Debbie can answer that or not. We got
Okay.
FLSA issues in that.
Well, I
I could-
suspect, just looking at the history and the changes in the numbers from last year to this year, that we're talking about a target on the order of 150 to 200,000. So, you know, that's, 150 is half of what we're spending. So I have to question if the return there is worth it. And I would still like to get to the point, if we approve this, to make it conditional on that we get something back before we accept the grant that talks about, at the end of 6 months, the end of the first year, second year, third year, that we see a certain amount of return, whether that be, 50,000 or 100,000. We need to determine up front, I think, what success looks like.
And I think we could get those metrics. Some of the difficulty we have is when a 25-year captain takes overtime shift, his overtime's going to be more than a
Right.
brand-new guy at $14 an hour
Yeah.
who's making 27. So to start slicing it that thin and trying to find out where our overtime, it can be difficult.
But historically, that standard overtime has been probably on the order of about 150, just looking at the budgeted amounts.
I would agree with that.
So where, we have, I get this will improve our efficiency, and it certainly gives us some space when people are not there. In other words, you can continue to staff all of your equipment and so on. But I just want to make sure we know what it's costing us going in, and it will cost us eventually. In 3 years, this goes on the tax bill,
Yes.
That's what it boils down to, or it comes from somewhere else. And we have enough of those decisions the way it is. So I just think we owe it to ourselves to have our expectations out in the open up front.
I will say this, I've reviewed several of the SAFER grants, and most of them are for when a city decides to open a new station
Okay,
for those personnel.
Yeah.
And looking back on what we did in 2013 by not adding any people, literally getting by, and due to the fact at the time that was the right decision because we added the 4th ambulance, we added the service level. But I wasn't here for those discussions. My understanding was the possibility existed that those positions would eventually, through the budget, work their way back into the budget, and they haven't yet.
I know one of our long-term needs for the department is to do something about Station 4. And if we did this sort of staffing adjustment, would that ease that transition any? Because I don't know, but I'm surmising that when we do that, when and if we do that, I guess I ought to say it that way, that will change staffing requirements also.
It will help. It will help. And I will say this, that when this SAFER grant first started, the first history of it, the first 2 years, new stations were eligible for it.
Yeah,
And they
yeah.
saw right away that, no, this is more for staffing people than,
Right.
so therefore, a new station would.
And I know one of the reasons that they reduced or took away the copay, the match, is because they were trying to deal with departments who laid firefighters off to deal with COVID. And we fortunately were not in a situation that we had to do that.
Right, and a lot of the history from the SAFER grants were, the addition of hiring firefighters were for those were the only allowable reasons, were for possible layoffs or retention of volunteer services. This is one of the first years they've allowed to
Well,
other departments to add people.
you may gather I struggle with this because I see it as a staffing increase outside of the normal budget cycle. And I just want to make sure that we understand up front what the expectations are so that when we get 3 years down the road, whoever's sitting at this dais has some basis for, you know, making a decision instead of just waiting until then and say, well, that worked or it didn't work. I just think we ought to establish some sort of metric that we can monitor and see if it is working.
And to your point, Commissioner Franz, one of the things we discussed was making sure that we don't expand our offerings or expand our expectations to where we find ourselves at the end of that grant cycle.
Yeah,
new
where the
commitments.
situation is, oh, we have to have these people now
Right.
because,
And so it may be a tough decision at that point that we go back to 2020 levels and
Right.
we're back to overtime levels like we're at right now. But
okay.
it's an opportunity to quantify what, you know, service gains, coverage gains, and the cost that went along with that
Yeah.
compared to the overtime savings.
I think one of the things that resonates with me, and it didn't occur to me until we're sitting here talking, is the whole idea that we need to, at some point, we need to talk about Station 4 seriously. And if this helps with that transition, then I am probably, it concerns me less than it would be if that was not on the horizon. And I know it's not in the plan now, but, you know, it's something we're going to have to do at some point. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hoppick here. I think a couple of my questions were asked as far as we're currently fully staffed, and another question I had was about the EMS versus firefighters, 'cause I know that's a high percentage of overtime. This calculates out to about $281,000 a year, and kind of like Commissioner Franz said, if we continue this on, does that include the 281, or does this full amount that we're receiving on this grant, does that take care of benefits and everything?
Yes, it came to like
So
$71,454.
that's the total package.
And
Okay.
that's a 2020 numbers from Human Resources.
The grant, is it a all or none? I mean, would there be a potential they'd come back and offer to fund 2 firefighters instead of 4, or is it's all or none?
You
Okay.
submit and you're either awarded or you're not.
Okay, because I didn't know if just 2 would be even beneficial. And I think from listening to a couple of the questions that Commissioner Franz had, I think we have to take into consideration the service to the public, the morale of the current staff, and then the cost moving forward. And I know that you said it's kind of hard to break down that overtime, and it sounds like 2019 had overtime, should have been considerably more than 2020 because of the individuals in training. One of the things I would like to see is that we somehow annually get some type of report that, even though I know it's not going to be 100% accurate, but can kind of give us a feel for what we are saving. So when we get to the end of that 3-year period, we know that even though we're not recouping all that cost from the saving overtime, it may be beneficial enough to go ahead and move on and keep those additional 4 firefighters in place. So.
Right.
If I could chime in on that, something I think that would be very helpful is if we pay this sort of scheduled overtime just by virtue of the way the department shifts and the interface with the, Department of Labor regulations. Firefighters get, 14 hours or something like that of overtime every couple of weeks, just because of the way the shifting works. And it would be nice if we could distinguish that, which is just kind of a part of our basic operation, from overtime that results from, people being sick or on vacation or off on injury leave or call volumes or whatever. That to me strikes me as a fairly important distinction in terms of managing the department.
And since I've been here, that's never been differentiated. That's never been split
It
up.
never has since I've been here either, Chief. So
Makes me feel
it's
better. I'm sure there's a way to do it.
yeah.
I'm not. And Commissioner Hoppick, to go back to yours, keep in mind 18 and 19 had merit increases too. So that's going to start. Last year did not, but still it's 5.5% versus 2%. So
Yeah.
those happened, which
And with respect to,
compounds.
with respect to the overtime number, there's, I think, an accounting change from 1919 to 2019, or 2020 to 2021, 2019 to 2020, I guess.
Correct.
And that makes that overtime number look like it has just ballooned, and it probably has not in reality.
Yeah, that's correct. Previously, the 1 of the 1.5 got attributed to payroll and the half got attributed to overtime.
Yeah.
We've made the decision from an accounting standpoint to fully report the overtime with the intention of getting a better sense of schedule issues and callback, what that was, to quantify that. So part of that increase from 2019 to 2020 is just from that change in accounting.
Maybe it would be, if we looked at it just in terms of raw numbers of, we had X amount of hours of overtime in 2018, X in 2019, 2020, and tried to separate it maybe a little bit from the actual value, we could at least, as I can't remember if it's Commissioner France or Commissioner Hoppick mentioned, differentiate between what's always going to be our baseline of overtime hours versus the more optional ones that we have a possibility to reduce or to affect by, with this grant with additional staffing.
And that's how I track my overtime, is by hours, due to the fact of the 25-year captain versus.
Right.
And I will say this as an example, when we had the 3 people in paramedic class, the class time is 1,400 hours of didactic time. That's in classroom time. That had to have been covered by us while that employee was there. Then they do a field internship of 480 hours out in the field. The students do their clinicals on their off duties days, up to $400 or up to 400 hours, and they're not compensated for that, and that's kind of their skin in the game, so to speak. However, when the students are in that class, we do have to cover for them, and that year just was a lot.
Yeah.
And we had how many people?
We had 3 people in that class.
Yeah, I would hope that the mechanics of this will work, even though we're not allowed to pay paramedics out of this grant. In other words, they have to be assigned to a fire unit, 51%. I would hope that somehow there's some sort of synergy between the fact that we have a shared department that you can help cover some of the absences for, medics having to be gone on transfers or whatever, and that you can limit your callback for coverage, even though these particular people may not be assigned to that, if you get my drift.
Absolutely. That was the intent.
There are several ways to do that, and hopefully that would increase the impact, I think, fairly substantially.
Mayor Hodges had mentioned too, and I think Commissioner Hoppick did too, the creeping up of the injuries is catching my eye a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that's totally, but there's several studies done that manpower on the fire scene, the more people you have there, the less work is involved across the board.
Yeah, and I'm repeating myself, but I think Commissioner Franz, you're correct. There's an opportunity to kind of have an offset there. The conversation we had is that this doesn't create an opportunity for expanded transfer capacity, which is a whole nother challenging conversation that we need to have.
I used to have a boss who told me work will expand to fill the time available. So, I mean, we're going to have to be watchful of that.
Correct.
Just to mention the fiscal note, there is a department would be responsible for the protective equipment, the fire gear, which we budget for that anyway for new hires of $9,200.
Any other questions from the commission before we open it up for any public comment or questions?
Nope.
Are there any members of the public that have questions or would like to comment on this issue?
I don't see any at this time.
Great, thank you. With that, I'll bring it back to the commission for further discussion or action.
Commissioner Davis, I move we approve the submission of the Federal Emergency Management Agency application for a fiscal year 2020 staffing for adequate fire and emergency response grant.
Commissioner Ryan, second.
Commissioner Franz here, or would you be willing to condition that we have a follow-up discussion within, say, a month to set some expectations as to what we expect to see if this is successful in terms of hours of overtime reduced or something like that?
Would a month be time enough? Because the grant proposal the grant wouldn't be awarded for a couple of months.
Correct.
Yeah,
It's usually about a 60-day turnaround,
right.
and it's due March 12th, Friday.
Yeah, and I'm not saying before we submit it, I'm just saying before we hear back, so we know what conditions of the acceptance might be.
Well, my impression is we'll be working through, this is going to be a fluid planning, at least for the first 6 months. Just having the warm bodies available would be required first before you deploy them and use them, and training. I just think there's a lot of moving parts. Certainly, I was going to say maybe 6 months in, but
6 months be enough?
Well, the problem is by that time, we will have already accepted the grant.
Yeah.
I think we need to have some sort of metrics before we accept the grant so that we can tell FEMA, yes, thank you, no thanks very much.
And that does happen. There are
know.
departments that are awarded, and then when it comes time to accepting, that they do deny it.
well, that's why I asked early on what happens if we didn't reach whatever goals we had. What happens to those positions? But if it's reasonable that those positions would be absorbed into our force anyway, at most it's a year, I would imagine, of carrying the extra staff.
This is Mike Sprague. If it helps, I think there may be two questions here. One is an agreement on kind of our metrics and what we think our goal is before we accept the grant. And then after we've accepted the grant, we're going to need to continue to monitor, see what our performance looks like at grant end, and then see if we want to continue that at our own expense. So I think what Commissioner Franz is saying is that 60-day conversation or a month conversation would be fleshing out the metric details before we accept the grant. And then to your point, Commissioner Davis, we would continue to monitor and make a decision at the end of the grant cycle whether we want to continue at our own expense.
All right, add that as an amendment or an amended motion.
That is my request, yes.
Okay, I'll go with that. The second agrees.
Second agrees.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. And I'll see if this language satisfies everyone to submit an application for the SAFER grant, conditioned upon having a discussion within the next 60 days. Was that
Before
what you
grant
wanted?
acceptance.
Oh, okay.
So and that's going to be about 60 days according to Chief, so.
Okay. 60 days or upon grant acceptance to establish metrics that we expect to achieve from this grant, as well as ongoing monitoring of the grant's impact on our fire department overtime in general.
Sounds good.
Is that okay? All right. We'll have a roll call, please.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner France,
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick,
Aye.
Commissioner Ryan,
Aye.
Mayor Hodges.
Aye. Motion passes 5-0. We don't have any development business. That takes us to other business. And I would just like to offer congratulations to our new Public Works Director, Jim Teutsch. I see that there he is. There he is in his virtual splendor. Congratulations, Jim. We're awfully excited to have you in your new role as Public Works Director, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much.
All right. And that's all I had for other business. Is there anything that,
I do have one comment that, and it's, I don't know if it's a comment or a suggestion or a question, but I've seen some stuff, material relating to the baseball proposal that we have on the table in terms of when we're going to proceed, and the narrative seems to be that we have kind of set it aside and abandoned it, and that's simply not the case. But the funding source did dry up and more or less go away for a time period, and so we've deferred that decision. And I'm just going to put it out for the other commissioners to consider, for not necessarily today, but if there's any desire to move forward with the transient guest tax legislation, get it in place so that when we do decide to proceed, we can proceed with some degree of efficiency. And of course, the idea would be not to proceed until there's enough cash flow in that source to support the project. But in the meantime, we can accumulate resources to apply to the project when we do proceed. That should give some assurance to the folks who are, I think they're just a little bit nervous about the reality of our intention to proceed with that project. And I think that would send a message that we are serious about it, about proceeding when, you know, the funding flow reestablishes itself.
Commissioner Franz, I was going to ask for the very same thing, not going in quite as much detail as you did, but request of the mayor that we schedule a conversation about that transient guest tax for very same reasons you're saying to us now. So I think the time is now to have that conversation. It'd be appropriate to calendar it in the near future so we can have it out there on the agenda for the community to comment.
Sounds good plan.
can I get some input from Commissioner Davis and Commissioner Hoffman?
Yeah,
I'd agree.
Okay.
Good
I do
idea.
also.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll get with City Manager Mike Scragg and we will see when we can get that on the agenda for discussion. And just to be clear, we're talking about we would be talking about the mechanism, how we're going to change the transient guest tax rate and get that legislation in position and ready to be used whenever we get to the point where that revenue source recovers. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that, because
Mayor, I think it'd be useful if staff could give us maybe some numbers on what that change might need to be in order to satisfy or work with the proposals we're hearing from the development group.
Mayor Hodges, my intention would be to put the tax in place, get all the legislation done, make it effective, start the cash flow, and then we're ready to proceed whenever the cash flow reaches a point where we think it is feasible to cover the cost of the project.
okay, sounds good. I just wanted to be clear on, expectations and what exactly we were looking at, discussing, and possibly taking action on, so that we're all on the same page. Thank you for the clarifications. I appreciate that.
Mayor, one last thing, we spoke about it briefly at the beginning of the meeting before the meeting was officially started, but I want to compliment Salina Media Connection and Deputy Manager Wood for his hours of testing. This has been a dream to work with, and it looks really good from the user position, 1,500 miles away. So it's job well done.
I agree. As the other Zoom participant, I just want to say, even from just across town, it's been great. So thank you to Salina Media Connection and to Mr. Wood for making this happen.
Hey, this is Deputy City Manager Jacob Wood. Just want to say it's really the IT staffs of both the city and the county that have done this. I just tested, so they did a great job getting it all together. So I don't want to take any of the credit from those guys. They did a great job.
Well, you did a great job troubleshooting and testing, so thank you. And is there anything else? And if not, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Commissioner Hoppick, I move we adjourn.
Second.
Commissioner,
We have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I think we can do that one without a roll call. Thank you very much, and we'll see you back here next week.